Thank you. I'm going to be talking about results from a pilot study in young healthy people using real-time fMRI neurofeedback in a paradigm where we train on actual finger tapping and test on motor imagery. First, a little background on real-time fMRI neurofeedback, roughly how it works and is set up. You have an individual in a scanner, and you take their bold data when they're doing a particular task. In our case, it's a flashing cross, and their job is to tap in time with the cross at slower and faster frequencies. In the training phase, you make a model of their brain state during each of the relevant task conditions. Once you have that model, later on, you can use it to give them neurofeedback based on their brain state in later conditions and try to guide them towards using particular brain states or patterns of activity. So our long-term motivation for this study is our interest in motor disorders, including Parkinson's and cerebellar ataxia, and the promise of real-time fMRI with neurofeedback in motor disorders where people have difficulty doing overt movements that might be necessary for physical therapy usually, but might have motor imagery circuits intact that overlap with the networks that are needed for overt motor execution and could potentially serve as a backdoor for motor rehabilitation. We're particularly interested in fMRI as our modality for neurofeedback because for motor disorders, subcortical structures, including the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, are particularly important. So fMRI, while it has lower temporal resolution, that's a big advantage for our interests. So in this study, we're just looking at young, healthy adults doing this paradigm where they're training on finger tapping and then given neurofeedback when they're doing motor imagery. Chose this particular finger tapping task because we think it has clinic translatability for the motor disorders that we'll be interested in down the road, Parkinson's and cerebellar ataxia, and because it's already been piloted in and out of the scanner. Right now the goal is just to demonstrate feasibility in this healthy population. This is what the task looks like. You have a crosshair with a flashing blue cross in the middle of the screen. Your job as a participant is just to tap in time with the cross. You get feedback based on how fast you're tapping. If you're tapping too slow, this bar will appear and it'll go to the left of the cross. Whereas if you're tapping too fast, it'll hover to the right. Now, depending on the task condition, you could be doing actual tapping or imagined tapping, and the feedback could be behavioral or brain-based neurofeedback. I'll lay out the different conditions in a moment. This is what it looks like. So here's the way our task is structured. We start with one run of actual tapping with behavioral feedback, and that serves to train our classifier. So the model is based on actual finger tapping at lower and higher frequencies. Then there's another run of actual finger tapping with brain-based feedback. I'm not going to talk about that one as much today. And then 2 runs of imagined tapping that's indicated by the kind of more ghostly looking hand, that it's imaginary tapping at lower and higher frequencies. And there you get brain-based neurofeedback based on the model that was made with actual tapping. Finally, there's one more run of actual tapping with behavioral feedback at the end. That serves to give us more training data for subsequent in-lab analyses if we want to look at group models and things like that. And also can serve as a preliminary measure of changes in performance from the beginning to the end of the task. So here we're looking at young healthy adults, and we have 17 of them. I'll start by showing you the behavioral results. This graph shows the change in speed from that first run of actual tapping to the last run of actual tapping. First run in green, last run in purple. For our 17 subjects. The trend at every frequency is that people start tapping faster at the end of the task. So speed isn't necessarily a good thing. It's not necessarily bringing you closer to target. For example, at 1 hertz, these young healthy people tend to start tapping a little too fast, and then speeding up brings them further away from target on average. Whereas at 4 hertz, people tend to start tapping slower than the target, and speeding up is generally a good thing. But speed itself is one relevant behavioral or outcome measure that could be relevant for our clinical populations down the road. Okay, so this in itself, this difference from the beginning to the end of the task, does not directly say anything about if the motor imagery with neurofeedback is working. We only have one session of data right now. We don't expect to see a lot of meaningful behavioral change, but we can take a first pass at seeing if particular patterns of brain activity, events that are going on during the motor imagery with neurofeedback might be related or linked to these behavioral changes just over the course of one session. Now, one of our hypotheses, our lab is particularly interested in the cerebellum and recently an interaction between the cerebellum and basal ganglia. There's a lot of evidence that there's an anatomical bidirectional link between the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, from the output area of the basal ganglia subthalamic nucleus through the pons to the input lobules of the cerebellum, and from the output nuclei of the cerebellum through the thalamus to the striatum and the basal ganglia. There's also a little bit of evidence for functional interaction supporting motor learning, and we took this task as an opportunity to both investigate the functional link between the cerebellum and the basal ganglia and its relation to motor learning, and to see whether cerebellar and basal ganglia activation or co-activation might be supporting performance in this task. First, I'll just show you the general linear model results of tapping versus rest and imagery versus rest. First, this is just actual tapping, all those runs where people are actually tapping with their fingers. See classic motor network activation, bilateral cerebellum that's more anterior, bilateral striatum, M1, some SMA. In motor imagery, we see a lot of overlap, a lot of the same areas, which supports our approach because, again, we're training on actual tapping and using that model to give feedback during motor imagery. So it's important that there's enough overlap that be translatable. But just visually, and if you indeed doing a direct contrast, there's no significant difference between the tapping and imagery, general linear models. But just visual inspecting these contrasts, we see bilateral cerebellum that may be a little more lateral than during actual tapping, which is consistent with the literature. And we see bilateral premotor activation and strong SMA activation as well. The warm colors indicate areas where activity during imagery was greater than rest, and the cooler, rest greater than imagery. Okay. So next I'm going to show you a specific analysis we did looking at connectivity between the STN, that output area of the basal ganglia, and the input lobules of the cerebellum. This is looking at the relation between the strength of connectivity between the STN with each cerebellar lobule and change in speed from the first run of this task to the last. A blue color indicates that an increase in speed from the first run to the last run is associated with a higher connectivity between the STN and that cerebellar lobule during motor imagery with neurofeedback. So for example, at 3 Hertz, which is shown on the right, we can see that cerebellar lobules, particularly on the left side, the strength of connectivity between those cerebellar lobules and the STN during our motor imagery with neurofeedback was correlated with increases in tapping speed from the beginning to the end of the task. So that's suggestive that cerebellar basal ganglia connectivity can be linked to either motor learning or change in motor performance for the beginning to end of this task. Now, I'll note again that speed does not necessarily mean accuracy. An increase in speed isn't necessarily bringing you closer to target, and that this correlation holds only for speed and not for accuracy. To take a first pass at looking at what might be predictive of changes in accuracy, we did a high-low median split of individuals who showed improvement in accuracy from the first run to the last run, measured as root mean squared error of their actual tapping performance versus the target. This is a preliminary look, but it seems that those individuals with higher accuracy improvement show more activation in some of the same areas we saw during motor imagery with neurofeedback, including the left lobule 6 or so, the cerebellum and cruise 1, and bilateral striatum, where the warm colors are areas where the high improvers showed more activation during motor imagery versus the lower improvers. So this is just a suggestive result that we want to follow up more rigorously, but it suggests that those individuals who are basically using the neurofeedback more effectively during motor imagery might be more successful. Okay. So again, our primary goal is just to demonstrate feasibility of this task in a population of young, healthy people. So the task works, they can do it. The neurofeedback works reasonably well. And we've also shown that basal ganglia and cerebellar activation separately and co-activation or connectivity might be linked to behavioral changes on this task, which is important for us because we're ultimately interested in motor disorders that affect the basal ganglia and the cerebellum, including Parkinson's and cerebellar ataxia. We've actually started collecting a little bit of pilot data in Parkinson's and cerebellar ataxia. Individuals with ataxia are in orange and Parkinson's are in purple. You can see that at 1 Hertz, individuals with ataxia tend to tap too fast, whereas at 4 Hertz they tend to tap too slow, which is consistent with other literature that at least some individuals with ataxia can have difficulty both with achieving an absolute speed and with the kind of fine motor timing and training that might be necessary to tap accurately at the lower frequencies. And we also see that the individuals with Parkinson's, there are not that many of them so far, but they tend to tap too fast at 1 Hertz and do okay at the other frequencies. But the bottom line is this shows that there's room for improvement in both of these groups on this task, and that it's feasible for them to do it. I'd like to acknowledge my PI, Sherry Marvel, and our collaborators, Stephen LeConte and Jonathan Lisinski, who had a poster on Monday that talked a lot more about the technical details of the method we used for classification. And I'd like to thank our funding agents. Thank you. Are there any questions?